People who nearly expired on the operating table. Did the doc tell you immediately after surgery, or did he wait until you had recovered a bit? What was it like receiving the news? Story 1. Well, I had surgery about 2 years ago, and apparently I started moving in the middle of it, trying to get up from the operating table. I was given general anesthesia. Apparently not enough, so they gave me extra. A lot extra. I was in recovery, and the nurse was trying to wake me up, and I was unresponsive. I guess they pumped me full of enough that my respiratory rate slowed down to the point where my O2 levels were low enough that organ failure was a serious risk. And the nurse was about to call the ambulance, since this was in a doctor's surgery suite in his office. I remember feeling incredibly at peace and feeling warm, as if I was floating. I was honestly the most comfortable I've ever been. The best way I can describe it is as if you wake up on a Saturday feeling rested and completely awake, yet you're so comfortable and at just the perfect temperature that you want to fall asleep for another hour, and you have no problem doing so. For your information, that never happens for me. Once I'm awake, that's it. 15 minutes extra. I won't be able to sleep no matter how much I want to. The nurse cracked open the ammonia salts under my nose to try and get a response from me. Nothing. She tried doing a sternal rub, grinding her knuckles into my sternum in my chest to the point that I had a large black and blue bruise afterwards. Over the next 2 to 3 hours, as the anesthesia wore off, more and more of my blood oxygen levels came up to normal levels, and eventually I was able to get up on my own and pee before they'd let me go home. For those wondering what happened, it was liposuction surgery, and right after I stood up, I was quoted by my ex-girlfriend saying at the time to the nurse, "I'm very upset with what the doctor did to me." The nurse said, "Oh my deity, what do you mean? What's wrong?" To which I replied, "I came in for breasts, and he gave me lipo instead." The nurse and my girlfriend laughed for the next 10 minutes while I continued shuffling across the bathroom to pee prior to releasing me to go home. Too long didn't read? Claimed I went in for surgery for boobs, and the doc gave me lipo instead, I'm a guy, and almost perished due to excess general anesthesia. Almost expiring was the most comfortable I've ever been. It's kind of amazing that this person was at ease when he was under that much anesthesia. I know what it's like to have your heartbeat slowed down to the point where you just don't really feel like you want to get up or anything. But why was he in there? Why did he think he was in there for breasts at all? And what did his girlfriend think of that? Story 2. I wasn't on the operating table, but I did expire. I had mono, and like my grandfather had just expired, and my parents had just gotten divorced, so I really downplayed how sick I felt for about 2 weeks. Then I was pretty much immediately hospitalized for another 2 weeks, and about 1 week in, through some kind of complication, I was 13, so this was 12 plus years ago, my spleen started rupturing. They decided to give me codeine or something with codeine in it. I told them I was allergic to it, but it wasn't on my charts. Honestly, I was alone and scared and knew my dad was allergic to it. I have a lot of his allergies. So they gave it to me anyway, thinking I didn't know what I was talking about. I don't remember this exchange that well. Either way, within about 15 minutes, it felt like my guts were being ripped out, and I remember at certain points losing the ability to control my screams, and that was pretty real. Insert morphine button. I don't know if any healthcare professionals are reading this and going, what the hell or not, and a lot of this I don't remember perfectly because it was a long time ago and I was terrified, but I assure you there was a lot of what the hell. So now I've got this morphine button for the pain because my screaming was freaking everyone out, and things just started to fall away. I don't know how much longer later, but my dad finally showed up. He was upset. I didn't care about anything at that point and fell asleep. I woke up 18 hours later to a nurse trying to fix my IV that had just broken in my arm. Apparently, my heart rate dropped so low that I was technically unalive due to a combination of all the meds and some internal bleeding or something. They told me later that day while I was still in the hospital, which is a lot like the time I was stuck on the runway on Christmas Day because there was a problem with one of the engines and we had to change planes. Only there was no one in the airport to let us out of the plane, and so after an hour, they announced they'd fixed the engine problem and we were taking off. Having to hang out in the hospital where a mistake almost unalived me was like that flight. Spent the entire time scared and double-checking everything. My son had mono a couple of years ago, and he said that was the sickest he's ever been. Just sounds like all-around incompetence on this hospital overall. They don't even take into account histories. If the person says his dad has an allergy, wouldn't they think to maybe check or maybe just do something else just to be on the safe side? Really? Story 3. About 10 days after I had an appendectomy, I returned to the hospital in severe pain with high fever, nausea, and having spasms around my sphincter. They did all the tests, blah, blah, blah. Turns out I had a huge freaking abscess behind my uterus. I think that means to be abscess. I'm admitted to the hospital again, and that night I had the worst nausea. I spent several hours straight doing nothing but dry heaving. My stomach muscles were shot. I could barely breathe because my diaphragm was exhausted from it. That morning, they told me to drain again it says access. It's abscess. I'm sure it's abscess. What they were going to do was use a big old needle and shove it through the big butt muscle because they couldn't get to it any other way. Ugh. They couldn't get me sedated, though. At that point, I had an inkling that something was wrong. But I was so high on meds that I didn't care. Then 1 minute, I was in an x-ray room, I think, with them telling me that the PICC line was in. I don't know if that's PICC or PIC. I don't remember them putting it in or being moved to that room, but apparently I was conscious. Anyway, they bring me back, lie me down, and give me another shot of whatever they used. I remember snippets of what happened, like being on the gurney surrounded by the crash team, but nothing else. I woke up in the ICU 3 days later on my birthday. I never saw the surgeon again, nor did I ever see my original appendectomy surgeon again, but that's another story. After the initial "are you okay" thing, and I was too messed up to remember that. I don't remember what I found out exactly. I don't remember when I found out exactly what happened, or if they even told me, but I didn't care because I needed to worry about healing. It really hit me 2 days before I was released, 10 days after admission, when a friend came to visit. But it wasn't emotional or anything like that. It was, hell, I almost expired, but I didn't. But I almost did. Oh, hey, morphine. It's hard now, though. It doesn't bother me that I almost expired because I didn't. It's the feeling helpless and hopeless, or remembering that feeling. This happened this June, so it's all pretty fresh. This one just sounds like this person is just floating into one state of consciousness or the other. And I don't know if it had anything to do with the appendectomy, but waking up in the ICU on your birthday? I guess it's kind of a birthday present, like, hey, you're still alive, but kind of a bummer that, hey, you got to celebrate in the ICU and maybe you can't have soda and cake. Story 4. I got my appendix out last fall. The surgery was supposed to be 45 minutes, home an hour later from the recovery room. When I woke up, I was in and out of sleep, asking for anti-nausea medication every time I woke up. I was told no each time. I promptly forgot that I was told no, fell asleep, woke up, and asked again. When I finally actually woke up, my mom told me that the surgeon had nicked a blood vessel and I'd been internally bleeding, so the surgery took 4 hours and I was back in my hospital room. They put some sensor massaging things on my legs to aid circulation, but at the time I was so drugged that I didn't even register it much. In the morning, my surgeon said that I'd been internally bleeding and they had to wait for it to stop, and that I'd be in the hospital for a few more days. I wasn't allowed to eat for 2.5 days after that, on top of the 24 hours prior. Before I was discharged 3 days later, the surgeon ordered an MRI to make sure I wasn't internally bleeding again. Once I was cleared, he said to me, "If you suddenly feel lightheaded or nauseated, call an ambulance immediately and tell them you're internally bleeding. If your legs or feet suddenly turn blue, call an ambulance and tell them you're losing circulation." That was the first time I really grasped that it had been a serious problem. A few weeks later, I asked my mom about what she'd done while she was waiting, and she mentioned that the surgeon had walked out and told her that I might expire, but he'd do everything he could. Too long didn't read. Surgeon kept me in the hospital for a few extra days and never directly told me how serious it was until I was discharged. If you suddenly feel lightheaded and nauseated, call an ambulance immediately and tell them you're internally bleeding. If your legs or feet suddenly turn blue, call an ambulance and tell them you're losing circulation. You would think that would mean you need to stay a few extra days. Story 5. Not quite the same as surgery, but I almost perished giving birth 8 months ago. It's not quite the sort of thing people typically worry about anymore, so I wasn't prepared. I was more worried about my son, who was 5 weeks early, because I had been bleeding a lot and they didn't know why. Well, 2 days of labor, and they finally decided to let him come. Right before I start pushing, my fever spikes to 104. Baby comes out and he's okay. I went to NICU and my husband followed. Then I go through the most incredible pain I've ever experienced for the next, what seems like hours, all the while genuinely believing I was going to expire. I was in and out of consciousness. The doctor kept telling me to stay with her. All of a sudden, they're rushing me to the OR with no explanation. When I got out, I found out that they couldn't stop my bleeding, so I was rushed to the OR to remove my uterus, aka the last hope to stop it. I had to have a blood transfusion because I lost over half my blood volume. My husband told me that when they told him about me going to the OR, they gave him no sign of hope. Basically told him they're doing what they can, but it doesn't look good. It was one of the most terrifying experiences I've ever been through. I was shaken up for weeks after. I think I'm genuinely more grateful for my life now, though. I cherish every moment with my kids and husband because I truly felt like it could be taken away from me at any moment. Holy hell. Hold those babies tight. I have never even thought of that type of thing through my labors. Ugh, glad you're okay. Story 6. Had surgery for an aortic aneurysm in June. It did not go to plan. I ended up expiring 4 times on the table and during an emergency CT scan. Apart from the ICU nurse, the first medic I saw within a couple of hours of waking up was one of the anesthetists. He came to tell me about the surgery and to reassure himself and his colleagues that I had made it through the night. He hadn't been expecting to be able to sit and chat with me. I felt sorry for him as he relayed the news because he looked so concerned and so relieved. He left saying that he was going to text all of his friends. The whole team came to see me throughout the day, and what had happened was carefully explained to me. There was no hogwashing or sugarcoating. My reaction was to thank them for all their efforts and to try and be cheery and show them that I was going to be okay. It's my coping mechanism. I didn't get weepy or tearful until the next day when it had sunk in a bit. Had a little cry on my brother's shoulder. NHS, I love you. That last bit rings true for me too, mate. That last part with the NHS was just really touching, because unlike being in America, thanks to being in a part of a medical system like that, it's just one less thing you have to worry about. Another reason to be thankful you're alive and in that area. Story 7. My appendix burst. Lots of pain, but then the pain went away when it burst. That was a Friday night. Monday morning came around. My girlfriend made me go to the ER. The doctor in the ER called a surgeon in because I was in so much pain. The morphine wasn't doing anything. The surgeon examined me, and a few minutes later, my girlfriend was there with a priest who was giving me last rites. I only remember this in bits and pieces at this point. I overheard the surgeon tell my girlfriend he will do everything he can for me, but I most likely won't make it out of surgery. I expired on the operating table twice, from what I was told. Many vital organs were shutting down or shut down. I was in the intensive care unit of the hospital for 4.5 weeks, and a normal hospital room for 2 more weeks. I don't remember dying or anything like that, but the surgeon was Iraqi. Hell of a nice guy on the follow-up visits afterwards. I even invited him to my wedding, seeing as how he made it possible. Wow, glad you survived it. I feel bad for your girlfriend. That must have been horrible to have to watch all that fold out. Story 8. I don't wish to get into the details, but an outpatient procedure went wrong, and 2 surgeries later and 10 days in the ICU went by. Apparently, they did tell me how close I was to perishing, but honestly, the whole month I spent in the hospital felt like about 10 minutes. Apparently, I experienced some short-term amnesia of the event due to the amount of painkillers, anesthetic, and overall pain. Fine by me that I don't remember. I also learned that when I'm put under twilight anesthetic for an endoscopy, I start spewing weird facts, Bubba Gump style. For one particular procedure, I guess I was giving every permutation of Papa Murphy's pizza toppings to the nurse. You can have pepperoni. You can have pepperoni and onions. You can have pepperoni and extra cheese. I don't eat Papa Murphy's. Story 9. When I was 11, I was in an accident where glass cut my ankle. The glass severed the major nerve, artery, and 5 tendons, including the Achilles. However, the artery was not severed all the way and was still hanging together by a tiny thread, which was causing me to bleed out faster than normal. Doctor had to perform surgery to clamp the artery with no anesthesia. My ankle always feels funny just typing that moment. Regardless, the doc couldn't do the full surgery, so I was sent to another hospital. The surgery was touch and go, and I almost didn't make it. Because of my age, doctors never told me. I only found out when I was a lot older just how close to perishing I was. It didn't affect me, honestly. Bleeding out, eventually things go numb and you have this wave of euphoria wash over. At 11, I was okay with perishing. Of course, the initial few minutes of panic was nuts. Talking about it now is crazy because I appreciate and respect life so much more now than when I was a kid.
Please like and subscribe if you've made it this far. I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the video and have a wonderful day.
Story 10. When I was a baby, about 6 months old, I got intussusception, which isn't uncommon in babies. Usually, babies with intussusception just need medicine and maybe a couple of other things, but there's never surgery involved. Unfortunately, this was not the case with me. After I had been ill for a couple of days, my parents took me to the local doctor who told them it was just a virus and there wasn't much to worry about. My parents took his word for it until I started worsening. Once again, they took me to another one of the doctors where I was examined by another doctor who, once again, told them it was nothing to worry about. This happened once more. After about 3 weeks of being ill, I started screaming and wouldn't do anything but cry and scream. I wasn't eating, and I was throwing up blood, so my parents took me to the hospital. At the hospital, I had immediate surgery in which they had to remove about a quarter of my intestines. To put it bluntly, I was pretty much unalive by that time. The doctors told my parents that I probably wouldn't make it through. My parents were obviously distraught. However, they told me that this was partly because of how blunt the doctors were about it. Apparently, they had just quoted meaningless statistics about blood pressure until in the last sentence, they said that I was going to expire. They then promptly left my parents in tears. By some miracle, I survived and am now healthy, so I suppose this story has a happy ending. Too long didn't read? Doctors were blunt and inconsiderate to parents because my intestines hate me. Story 11. One of those is not an operating table, but a story. Let me start by saying I was helmet and shirtless. Helmet? You're helmet and shirtless? How do you be helmet and shirtless? Sounds like an indie band name. At about 9 years old, I wanted to race dirt bikes, and my parents took me out to the public track to try it out. Well, after about 2 hours of messing around, the 9-year-old kicked in and I wanted to go play on the swings at a park nearby. I went over there, without my parents, and after realizing the park was run down, noticed a huge steep asphalt hill next to it. Went down it the first time, was fine. Second time, no problem. But the third time, my brakes gave out and my handlebars started wobbling, also known as speed wobble. Before I could react, my handlebars went all the way to the side, and I flipped over the handlebars, slamming my head on the ground. The bike landed on top of me, and I slid on my back for about 20 to 30 feet. During the slide, I remember closing my eyes and seeing myself outside of my body sliding down the hill right after I hit my head. As I came to a stop, I remember shooting back into my body and opening my eyes and letting out the biggest scream a 9-year-old could produce. I didn't know until about 6 or 7 years later that this is common in people who have expired and came back. I ended up spending the whole next day and night in the ER. They couldn't get an IV in me, so they had to scrub my raw flesh back with no painkiller. There was a lot more to the pain after care, but I need to stop rambling on. Story 12. When I was in high school, I got an MRSA staph infection in my hand. Really bad one underneath my thumbnail. When in surgery to remove the nail, they had ruptured a fluid-filled sac, and the fluid spread into my body, putting my body into a septic state. This resulted in toxic shock syndrome, which can get pretty bad. Anyways, after about a week in hospital dealing with this and being pumped with antibiotics, I was cleared to leave. While saying thank yous and goodbyes, he tells my mama that if I waited another 15 minutes before going to the ER, there's a good chance I wouldn't be here. A girl I knew in high school perished from a DIY belly button piercing, which led to a staph infection. At first, she didn't want to tell her parents about the piercing, and by the time she got to the hospital, her body had gone into sepsis and her organs had started to shut down. It happened super fast, too. She went from fine to unalive over the course of like 2 days. Scary stuff. Story 13. I had a routine splenectomy when I was, maybe 11 or 12. Great memory here. And only found out maybe 5 or 6 years later the regular 2-hour surgery took 5.5 hours because they hit an artery and I was bleeding out. Recovery time was probably a month, where the first week I could barely breathe and couldn't move in bed. Had a second splenectomy maybe 2 years later. Went through the same holes, and complete recovery was maybe 4 or 5 days, and I wanted to leave the hospital the same day as the surgery. My mom was the one who informed me, and it was literally the first surgery took so long because they hit an artery. And my reaction was just, no biggie in my mind, because maybe I was younger, or because why drag on about stuff that already happened? I think you and I have a different idea of what routine means. I hope. Story 14. When I was 18, I was sent to the hospital. I kept blacking out and having these weird massive seizures. I lost a good day or two until I finally came to. I looked around and saw my whole family. I was scared and crying because I had no idea where I was. My family started crying, and the only person who said anything was the doctor. He looked at me and said, "I don't know what's wrong with you, but you can be sure I'm going to figure it out." Looking back, it was a pretty bad moment for him, and was really reassuring for me. Seriously, I believed him, but I kind of ruined the moment when I said, "Thanks, but can I have some pants?" Well, when you need pants, you need pants. Story 15. I almost perished during surgery last year. Apparently, in the middle of it, I had a huge spike in my blood pressure, and they had to stop the surgery to bring it back down before they could finish. I don't know when the doctor was planning on telling me, though, because as soon as I woke up and saw one nurse sitting on the edge of my bed and 2 more standing at the end, I knew something was wrong. I don't think I almost perished, but on my last surgery on my legs, 4 total, my blood pressure also had a huge spike. I got through the surgery, but it took hours for my blood pressure to come back down. Story 16. I had a large, softball-sized ovarian cyst, and it ruptured. I lost a lot of blood and nearly perished. I received 7 pints of blood, 5 I think, over the course of my hospital stay. They never used the word nearly perished or even emergency. The doctor called it a crisis or distress. This was described to me in such a calm, cool manner, I didn't immediately realize there had even been a problem until my husband and family were in my room crying about nearly losing me. I was still kind of groggy, but I was like, what the hell are you all so upset about? Story 17. I was in the OR for an extra 3 or 4 hour surgery, majorly messed up. Surgeon came out and told my dad he messed up, and it was his first mess up in years. It's not that scary to almost perish on the OR table. It's the aftermath of learning how to survive. I lost 100 pounds, was not remotely overweight. I gained weight while in the hospital due to 50+ pounds of infection in my body, and learning how to walk and breathe again. 0 out of 10 would not be recommended. And remember, a lot of surgeries are easy, but bowel surgery, if it messes you up, you are messed up because what is in your GI tract is not meant to be in any other part of your body. Story 18. Not a surgery, but a medical emergency. I was a stupid 15-year-old and got alcohol poisoning. The ER doctor told my parents if I had gotten there 30 minutes later, I most likely would have perished. It was a sobering reality, to say the least. I straightened up and was a model student for the rest of high school. I didn't have the invincible attitude that most teens have. I still made mistakes and was a normal teenager, but I was just more aware than my friends that stupid in-the-moment choices do have consequences. I was always the DD and the one checking on people who got themselves so messed up that they were sick or unconscious. It got old, but I know on more than one occasion I prevented a potentially devastating event from occurring. Story 19. I fell backwards onto concrete from 20+ feet head first when I was 12 years old. I stuck out my arm whilst falling, and it snapped in two. One of those few people who has touched his left elbow with his left hand. Fractured shoulder and skull. Lost a lot of blood and only had about 20 minutes of consciousness in 4 days. Didn't expire on the operating table, but I perished between my fall and waking up in the hospital bed. Took my mother about 20 minutes of me waking up to tell me I unalived myself, and I need to thank all the doctors, nurses, and everyone else for bringing me back. She also reminded me at regular intervals she would strangle me if I did anything similar again. Story 20. I had an emergency surgery and woke up in the ICU. I think it was because I threw up during surgery since it wasn't a planned surgery. I had food in my stomach. I ended up spending a week in the hospital. The doctor didn't actually tell me a thing, actually. He talked to my parents. I too had emergency surgery on my colon, woke up in ICU. It was not pleasant, do not recommend. I didn't perish on the table or anything like that. The doctor did say I had about 12 hours left before it, though. Story 21. Uterus ruptured. Doctors didn't know. All they knew was I was having complications during labor. I go back for the emergency C-section that I'm supposed to be awake for. They cut me open, discover the problem, and immediately knock me out. I woke up to my female doctor rubbing my forehead and cheeks, telling me God was with me that day and I was going to be okay. Nurses and other personnel came from all over the hospital to visit me over the next few days. Everyone wanted to meet the girl who cheated fatality. It was kind of neat. Sort of. Story 22. I was operated to take out my old shunt. I have hydrocephalus. I was only given a local anesthesia so I could talk with the doctor during the procedure, but was pretty out of my mind. So in the middle of a conversation, we started talking about sports, and the surgeon told me he was a fan of my team's rival team. I proceeded to talk trash about his team while he stood there with a scalpel in hand. You are one brave mother. Story 23. I actually perished. Had 2 open-heart surgeries when I was about 3 and 9. During the second surgery, I flatlined for about 3 minutes, according to the doctors and my mom. They attempted to bring me back during that time period, but I wasn't responding. Around the 3-minute mark, my heart started beating. 30 now, and I'm due for another and hopefully final procedure to replace the valve that I've outgrown. Hopefully within the next 18 months. Best wishes on your procedure. Story 24. Following heart surgery, my wife was told by the surgeon that I had a 50-50 chance of surviving. She did not tell me that she was told that until about a month after I recovered. I'm glad she waited to reveal this to me. It would have been frightening to know right away. I still have bad dreams about it and anxiety whenever I go to the doctor, even for the most routine of visits. Story 25. My friend from university was born technically unalive, but the doctors revived him and he miraculously survived. He's a brilliant kid with a slight speech impediment due to oxygen deprivation at birth. He knew growing up he was different, so when his parents eventually told him the story, he wasn't surprised. But he lives a fully functional life, so it's not all bad. Story 26. Well, when I was 12, I had some surgeries, and after the last one, I woke up and couldn't talk for 2 days. As in, no sound at all. Turns out I had stopped breathing during surgery, and they had to shove a tube down my throat and breathe for me till I started waking up from the anesthetic, and they removed it before I was fully awake, but dang, that stuff really hurts. Story 27. I had open heart surgery a few years ago. I didn't know that when I was on a heart-lung-whatever machine, I'd be charged $75 for being revived. Well, congratulations. You've answered the age-old question. A human life is worth $75. Story 28. Perished during my C-section. Went into cardiac arrest. They weren't going to tell me. My mom had to. All I remember is seeing my beautiful baby girl saying, "I need to vomit," and then nothing. Honestly, it made me a lot less fearful of fatality. Story 29. No one could really tell me anything for a day or so. It took about 3 days for me to get my head around the facts. Stupid appendix.
Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.